Good evening, everybody, and welcome to EPA's community information session on our regulation of the Kealba landfill to support the release of a recent report. As many of you know, my name's Stephen Lansdell. I'm very proud to be our Western Metropolitan Regional Manager for EPA. I'll chair tonight to help work through some of the information we'll share. Personally, before we talk a bit more about the running of the night, I would really like to acknowledge the impacts the recent hotspots issue in particular has had on a lot of you, and I'd also really like to acknowledge your leadership, your resilience, and your patience to work with us through the issue, but also through some really trying times over the past 18 months. In terms of housekeeping, would like to make sure you're aware that tonight's presentation will be recorded, and that recording and all the slides that we will work through will be made available on our website within the week. So in that context, there is a fair bit of text and information on the slides to support not only yourselves in listening to this afterwards, but people that may not be able to attend tonight to work through the information. We will also be running question and answer sessions throughout the night on some particular sections, and you'll notice on in the right hand top corner of your screen you're able to enter a Q&A function, which means you can write in questions at any point throughout the night. You can also vote on your favourite questions so that we can make sure we get to the most popular questions. We'll obviously be endeavouring to get to all or as many as we can tonight, but we'll certainly follow up on any that we don't get through tonight and use them to inform updates to our websites and ongoing engagement. Firstly, for the night, I'd like to introduce our Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Lee Misas, to introduce tonight. Thanks, Lee.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you everyone for attending and taking the time to join with us on a pretty cold and now wet Monday night. Now, I appreciate that this has been relatively short notice in terms of pulling this together, and I'm really pleased that you have been able to join with us. I will start by acknowledging traditional owners, so the Wurundjeri people, and certainly EPA acknowledges Aboriginal people as the first peoples and traditional custodians of the land and water in which we live, work and depend, and we certainly pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. As Victoria's environmental regulator, we pay respect to how country has been protected and cared for by Aboriginal people over many tens of thousands of years. And we recognise the unique spiritual and cultural significance of land, water, and all that is in the environment, and the continuing connection and aspirations for country of Aboriginal people and traditional custodians. I would also, as Steve has done, like to acknowledge you as a community, recognising the impacts that these hotspots have had on each of you. I know at times over this journey it must have felt like we at the EPA aren't on your side, but I want to let you know that that's not the case. We have, and the team has over the journey been working diligently to get this issue dealt with as safely and as quickly as is possible. And you know, hotspots are difficult issues to deal with, and the approach that's been taken is one that's been in to a large degree relatively cautious, because we don't want in attempting to fix the problem to actually make the problem worse. But I think that the report that we'll talk about today hopefully goes through and shows the amount of effort and focus that this issue has had, and I can assure you continues to have for the EPA. But I know for some of you that it's taken 18 months, that it's still ongoing. That Barrow Group is talking about another 12 months is deeply frustrating and disappointing, and I do want to acknowledge that. I think it's important that we as an organisation acknowledge that, and I do ask that you know, when I tell you that we are committed to this and we have and continue to really focus on remediating this issue, getting these hotspots, removing these impacts from you as quickly and as safely as we can, that is what our focus is. So today's session and tonight's session is really very much focused on the report that we have put together that really tells the story of the hotspots, but equally the actions that we've taken as an organisation leading up to and post those hotspots. It's a report that was requested by our Minister, Minister Lily D'Ambrosio, who is the Minister for Energy, Environment and Climate Change, and also Minister for Solar Homes. And I also know, and not sure if she's in attendance, but certainly Natalie Suleiman has been certainly a very, very strong advocate for this community into the EPA, and I do want to acknowledge that she has raised this issue in Parliament and has raised this issue directly with me and with the organisation over a number of times over the past 12 months or past 18 months. We will hear today from a number of the team in the EPA who have worked very closely on this, and they'll take you through elements of the report that we've produced and that we have released. And that really, as I said, is the focus for today. And it is the first, I think, session that we at the EPA have engaged with you directly without Barrow Group in the room. And at the end, Andrew Sargent, and you may have seen on the agenda, we'll want to have a conversation with you about how we best, as an entity, continuing to engage with you through this process and bringing this process as quickly and as safely as we can to a conclusion. So that was a bit of an opening from me, Steve. I'll be around all afternoon, all evening. And we'll work through any questions as they arise, but I'll hand back to you now.
Thanks very much, Lee. So hopefully now you can see the agenda for tonight. Really wanted to focus in on 4 key areas for the evening. First up, around our regulatory timeline. You'll find lots of information in the report around that, and to help us with some of that section, we'll have our Director of Developments and Infrastructure, Mr. Con Lawless, joining us. Next on the agenda, we'll talk through the hotspots issue in more detail and our regulation of that. And joining us for that, we'll have our Compliance Enforcement Team Leader, Varanga Abe-Wickramer, which I know many of you are familiar with. And then next on the agenda, we'll focus on the odour, air quality and your health. There's obviously a lot of information in the report on our website there. And joining us there, we've got our Acting Deputy Chief Environmental Scientist, Dr. Jen Martin, who I know many of you have also met in previous forums. And lastly on the agenda, we'll, as Lee said, hear from Andrew Sargent, Manager of our Stakeholder Solutions, about ongoing engagement and the best ways for you to stay informed as we move through the night. So just a reminder, in case anyone's joined in the last few minutes, we will have a short question and answer time after each of those sections to try and address as many of those questions as we move through the topics. This presentation will be recorded. The slides will be made available on the website for anyone there, and you can see the questions and answers on the right hand side of your screen, and certainly press the thumbs up for a particular question of interest so that we can make sure we're trying to address the most popular and wanted questions throughout the night. So first up on the agenda, we wanted to talk a bit about the regulatory timeline. So thank you very much for joining us, Con.
Good evening, Stephen.
And maybe just to paint a picture, there's obviously a lot of text on this slide, but there is more detail in the report, which really shows the life cycle of our regulation to date, right through from approvals in 2002 through more of the operational regulation when the site really started operating as a landfill in 2014, and obviously some details around the hotspots, which began in November 2019, and some information around future steps, particularly some of the next steps throughout July and September. I do want to acknowledge, I know many of you have lived in the area and had a keen interest in the site before it was a landfill, so that's why we thought it was really important to include some of this information in the report around our regulation right throughout the life cycle. In terms of the approvals, I might throw to you, Con, to talk a bit
Thanks,
more
Stephen.
about these in detail.
Thanks. So, Stephen, I think it's important to note that the site was originally a quarry and used for extractive industry, which was in fact very common in the 80s and 90s. It was only in August of 2001 that Barrow Group in fact submitted a works approval application so that they could establish what was then called a solid inert landfill, and solid inert refers to a type of waste called solid inert waste, which is in effect hard waste, mainly from municipal and industrial sources. EPA granted its works approval in February 2002, but with some fairly strict conditions, so much so that it was only in June of 2009 that Barrow Group then submitted a licence application. And after a long process of Supreme Court and VCAT proceedings, a licence was ultimately granted in September 2013. And then, as you mentioned, Steve, the landfill commenced operation in early 2015. EPA reviewed the licence in March 2017 and imposed some additional conditions. And Steve, those conditions are noted in pages 22 and 23 of the report. And I should also add that in August of 2018, at the request of Barrow Group, some additional conditions were put in there, specifically in relation to adding new cells 4 and 5. And to take us to current date, and under, of course, the new Environment Protection Act commenced on the 1st of July, 11 days ago, and this licence has been transitioned into the new Act. And I do want to point out, Steve, that under the new Act, EPA must review all licences every 4 years, and this is certainly one licence that'll be high on EPA's list of review in that period. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Con. Next on the timeline, we wanted to share some of the information in terms of more of the operational regulation of the site. So really from the time it began operating in 2014 onwards. I think the really important thing is that this landfill has been regulated really consistently with all landfills across the state, but also using what we call our licence operator risk assessment model. And I think it was about 2012, EPA worked to develop this model, designed it based on international best practice, particularly some experiences in United Kingdom around that, to help us take the most risk-based regulation of all licensed sites. So that model takes into account the activity, in this case, obviously landfilling. It takes into account things like location and proximity to residents or other sensitive receptors, and also considers compliance history and the like. So all of those things inform our regulation and compliance and assessment checking of the site. What you can see on this slide is a diagram to help explain a few of the different checks and balances, that it's not just EPA's own licence and EPA's own licence compliance inspections and assessments that take place. There are a number of rigorous conditions and expectations around Barrow and any landfill operator developing environmental monitoring programs, submitting annual performance statements and any notifications of breaches. And EPA assesses all of these reports, as well as responds to pollution reports from you as public or other sources, and undertakes our compliance inspections. But also, as many of you heard through other forums, there are expectations and requirements around the use of EPA appointed environmental auditors. So they are independent auditors that have obligations under the Environment Protection Act, and they have a really clear role in landfills for assessing the operational running and requirements of those. And there are a couple of audit reports that are publicly available on our website that have been run through that program. As you can see, before the hotspots issue came to life, we had 3 really key licence compliance assessments throughout those years from 2014 to 2018-19, and a key dust pollution report in September 2018 was really the focus of where our site assessment had been, as well as updating our best practice guidelines and other steps along the way. Thank you. So, Con, I might throw back to you. I know you've touched on some aspects of the operating licence transition. I know many in the community are aware we've issued a show cause notice to Barrow with a response due the end of this week that is around showing cause as to why they should not have their operating licence suspended. So that process we can't say too much further other than we'll await Barrow's response at the end of this week and determine next actions. But Con, was keen to invite you back and to talk about some of the key aspects of our new Act and general duty and enforcement.
Thanks, Stephen. So the main point is the third point, which is the introduction of the general environmental duty. And this is an incredibly transformative development in the law, because what it does is that it places the prevention of harm to human health and the environment at the centre of the laws. For the last 50 years, that the laws had been predicated on the control of pollution, so that the regulator's task was to control pollution and control its effects. It really lacked the tools, if I may now say, to actually deal with risks and harm. So Stephen, it's an incredibly transformative set of laws that we now have, and all the ancillary laws, including the powers of our officers, are predicated on ensuring that the general environmental duty and the other preventative parts of the law are given full effect. As I indicated earlier, EPA intends to review this licence word for word, condition for condition within the coming 4 years, and I'm in fact in charge of that process, and we are putting together a project plan for that now, and I can assure the community that licences of these nature are of the highest priority. Steve, was there anything else you'd like me to remark on?
Thanks, Con. I'm conscious of time, so keen to get into the question and answer part of tonight for the regulatory timeline. Now, I do note there's a number of really good questions that will be addressed in further sections. I'm just having a look for key ones relating to the regulatory timeline. Actually, there's one from Mario here that's got a few likes and relates to our approval to grant Barrow Group a licence to operate the landfill. So it talks about hotspots are widespread within the landfill industry, and the report and some quotes from page 12 in our report. And I guess the crux of the question is hotspots widespread within the industry. So why did EPA grant Barrow Group a licence to operate a landfill so close to homes? Con, happy for you to provide any more detail on our landfill approvals. But I guess the key thing I'd note, Mario, is that our approvals were issued taking into account the regulations and the law and the best practice guidelines at the time, which included consideration of buffer distances. And as you say, there's clearly focus on hotspots across the landfill sector. Con, was there anything else you wanted to share on that?
No, I think you have it well covered, Stephen. Thank you.
Thanks, Con. I might. No, I think most other questions relate to information and sections we will get into throughout the night. So I would rather focus a bit more on getting to our hotspots information. And welcome Varanga Abewikrama, our Compliance Enforcement Team Leader.
Thanks, Steve. Good evening, everyone. So we talked a little bit about regulation of the landfill. I think now's a good time to start talking about hotspots and a little bit about landfill design. We won't go into too much detail, but I'll talk a little bit about the design of this particular landfill, and it might give some context to what hotspots are and how they might have started. So in this slide, you can see a cross-section, and it's a cross-section of this particular landfill, Kialba landfill. If you look on the right, you'll see Maribyrnong River to the west, effectively, or to the east, sorry. And then you'll see to the western side, you'll see a local road, which is actually Sunshine Avenue. In between, there's a quarry wall, and then you'll see the landfill cells. So this landfill is below ground in the quarry void, and it's a clay-lined landfill with which means that its base and its sidewalls are clay, and above that clay layer is a drainage layer which is gravel. And then in this cross section, you can actually see what we look for as a regulator in some of the risks we try and prevent. And so in this cross section, you can see we're trying to protect the Maribyrnong River from pollution from waste that impacts on groundwater, because groundwater ultimately flows to the river. And we're also trying to reduce impacts on homes through odours. We're trying to reduce impacts on community from litter emissions and dust and noise. So this site model gives you a bit of an indication of how landfills can impact on their surrounding neighbours. Hotspots in general are an area of hot waste below the landfill surface, and they can emit smoke and volatile gases that cause odours. The hotspots in this instance are quite deep-seated, so they're further towards that gravel drainage layer, which is at the base of the landfill. And because they're deep-seated, they're not something that you can see. So it's not a flame, or it's not something that you can see smouldering on the surface of the landfill. It is something approximately 15 to 20 meters deep. And symptoms of hotspots are what landfill operators are often looking for and trying to prevent. And those are often smoke and volatile gases and odours. The likely cause of the hotspots in this instance, because they're deep-seated hotspots, is likely to be from oxygen or air ingress into the base of the landfill. What we're seeing on the ground from our regular inspections and speaking to the site operator and their experts is that it appears that the oxygen ingress has come from the gravel drainage layer beneath the waste, and that drainage layer is set for what's designed to capture leachate that is generated from within the waste mass, and leachate's quite a potent liquid substance, so it's not a good thing to have in a landfill. Generally, our regulations set maximum levels that landfills can have. In this instance, this landfill was compliant with our license conditions around how much leachate it could have. In actual fact, this landfill actually was quite dry, so that drainage layer is thought to have been very dry, and so not having leachate in it may have been a pathway for oxygen to get in and generate. And oxygen's one component of hotspot generation. So you need heat, you need an organic substance to burn effectively, and you need that oxygen to help drive it. And in this instance, it appears that the oxygen's come in there from the drainage layer, and likely been a big supporting element to the hotspot generation. We're doing regular inspections, and we're regularly looking at the waste that's being pulled out of the landfill. And in those inspections, we look at the waste, and what we're seeing is what is consistent with burnt solid inert waste. So we're seeing that the landfill operator doesn't appear to have taken on any illegal or toxic waste that's being burnt. It is the typical demolition waste and municipal waste that's being burnt. So it doesn't indicate that there's been any improper waste acceptance practices on the site. We'll move on to the next slide. And a little bit about, and we've gone to a different angle here on this slide. So this is an aerial view of the landfill. To the southwest, or to the left-hand bottom left corner, you can see Sunshine Avenue, McIntyre Road, and to the north and the east is Maribyrnong River. For context, you can see there's 4 landfill cells here: cell 1, cell 2, cell 4, and cell 5 north. They're the current 4 cells that are on this site. And there's 4 hotspots that are generally indicated on the plan there. You can see hotspot 1 towards the east and hotspot 4 towards the west. Now, the 4 hotspots are located 15 to 20 meters deep in the waste, as I've said before. So a key part of the regulation of this issue, because it's so deep, was understanding the extent of the hotspots. Once in November 2019, when we started receiving community reports of odour pollution, and then Barrow notified us of the discovery of hotspots, EPA's first priorities were around preventing harm, so understanding impacts on air quality, and then there was also about understanding more about the hotspots so that the hotspots could be extinguished. And a key part of extinguishing it was understanding the footprint of the hotspots. So through that, we served a cleanup notice on Barrow Group, and they drilled approximately 100 investigation wells to try and identify the extent of the hotspots. Through that process, they identified these 4 hotspots here that you see on the plan. After that, we served additional notices that required Barrow Group to develop a remediation strategy, and that strategy was approved in consultant in consultation with our internationally recognised landfill expert. There is a current remediation strategy that basically involves digging up the hot waste and cooling it down. While that sounds like a simple process, it's actually quite complex because the waste is burnt, and there's risks that come from that in terms of subsidence of the ground level, in terms of generation of odours, in terms of generation of smoke. So there's a whole heap of risks that need to be managed through that process. So it's quite a careful process that needs to be regulated. So waste is dug up. It's spread out over a temporary laydown area, which on the plan you can see up in the top corner. And that temporary laydown area is constructed clay pad with proper drainage to collect leachate and allow the waste to be spread out and cooled. And then once the waste is cooled, it's been temperature checked consistently, and then it's put back into the landfill again. So Barrow Group selected the current strategy based on the depth and the location and the stability of the waste, knowing that it can't be seen. So the remediation strategy is done through the borehole drilling, investigations, temperature checking. So there's a lot of monitoring and measurements that have to be undertaken to try and visualize what's happening because we can't see it with our own eyes. Barrow Group have made significant progress on the removal of 3 of the 4 hotspots. You can see hotspots 4, 3 and 2 towards the southern end of those landfill cells. Hotspot 4, for all intents and purposes, has been removed, so that's done. Hotspots 2 and 3 almost towards the base of the landfill, almost towards that gravel drainage layer. They're only about 1.5 meters from the base, so they're almost done with removing those 2. But hotspot 1 is believed to be the one that's generating most of the odours that you're smelling, and that's the one there might be some suspicion that it may have grown, and this is why Barrow Group are now doing additional works to try and investigate the extent of that hotspot. Thanks. So EPA's regulatory approach, as I mentioned earlier, first port of call when you contacted us in November 2019 was prevent harm, and that was emphasised through the air quality monitoring that commenced very shortly after the hotspots were discovered, and then it's been to reduce the odour and fix the hotspots. Now, unfortunately, reducing the odour is somewhat tied very strongly to fixing the hotspots as quickly and safely as possible. Ultimately, we know you've been living with this for such a long time, 18 to 20 months, and those ongoing odours have been largely because some of the hotspots are still present, and they're still generating air odour emissions. And remediation is unfortunately excavating up that hot waste and potentially exposing it more to the atmosphere and making potentially the odours a bit stronger. EPA is really focusing on putting regulatory pressure onto Barrow Group, and that regulatory pressure is proportionate to the harm that it's causing to you in the St Albans and Kealba communities. We've heard from you about the impact it's having on your physical and mental health and well-being, and heard that loud and clear. So our regulatory pressure is proportionate to that. We're doing regular targeted odour surveillance, compliance inspections, regulatory notices have been issued. We've issued 5 regulatory notices. We're looking at the way we license the site, as Con talked about before, in the review phases of the new Act, and we've served sanctions as well. We're making sure everything that can be done is done, and our regular inspections are really making sure that Barrow Group does not slip and is doing everything it can. And then a key part of our note. Sorry, I'm probably running out of time, aren't I? A key part of our regulatory notices have been about informing you about the issue and your health. And so that's why through our notices, every one of our 5 notices served since December 2019 has required air quality monitoring to be carried out by Barrow Group, as well as them to do community engagement. We want to make sure that we're reaching everyone that's being impacted to provide up-to-date information.
Thanks, Baranga. Just a word of warning, if we could try and move through the next couple of slides, just so we can get to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. So as I said, we've served 5 cleanup notices before, and each one's been targeted to the emerging risks. So we haven't served just one and waited. It's been about targeted cleanup notices at the risks because it's such a dynamic issue. We're taking on your feedback in each of these notices that we draft and serve. We've served an official warning in December 2019 for Barrow's late notification of the issue. We've served an infringement notice for lack of daily cover, which came from community information, and we've served a show cause notice to Barrow Group, as discussed before. We're in your community every week at least. We're checking compliance all the time. We're trying to make sure that Barrow minimise impacts as much as they can while they do this work. And finally, eliminating the hotspots. So we're going to be enforcing the first milestone that Barrow Group missed, and it's in our cleanup notice. The investigation's in progress. We're also working with our co-regulators and fellow support agencies at MFB, WorkSafe, local council to gain expertise and independent experience to shape the air monitoring and the remediation planning. And we're trying to adapt and influence better practice from Barrow and learn as this process goes on.
Thank you, Viranga. Appreciate there's a lot of information, obviously, that we wanted to share on hotspots. Just having a look at the Q&A section here. Just wanted to note one from Anonymous at 8:09 PM saying, has the rubbish that is being exhumed at the Kielba landfill been analysed for illegally dumped rubbish? I think just to highlight, as you mentioned earlier, Viranga, our inspections regularly look at burnt material and waste acceptance procedures, and the waste is all very consistent with that solid inert that they're licensed to accept. Anything else you'd like to add on that?
No, other than last week, for example, a good indication is last week we were on site, we saw some steam coming off some waste. We had a look, picked it up. It was quite warm. It was just the typical plasterboard. So it's just, I guess that's an example of just that typical waste that that looks kind of, you know, like the normal typical waste can get warm. So yeah.
Thanks, Viranga. And there's a good question with a few likes from Marion here earlier. The report indicated 2 possible entry points for oxygen into the cells, and sounds like issues with the landfill design. So Marion's interested, will EPA allow the landfill to resume operation following hotspot remediation with the current design?
That's yeah, definitely a key focus. Marion. As the current notices are all about remediating the hotspots, but that's a future part of our regulation. Will be actually, once the hotspots are out, how can waste go back into these landfill cells safely? And so some of the controls that Barrow Group need to do. And as we've spoken about before, there is a general environmental duty and that state of knowledge that I know we've talked about in previous forums. And that state of knowledge about this issue and the causes is being built all the time, and Barrow Group will be required to do everything that they can to deposit waste in the future in a safe manner.
Thanks, Viranga. And I'd just reiterate there's also involvement of auditor verification through both our notices and ongoing operational audits that will certainly require to look at any learnings and design issues, as well as through any review of the license as possible. Thank you. I think maybe just one more question here from Anna. Looks as though both EPA and Barrow unable to establish the exact extent of the hotspots. Why have the EPA not requested Fire Services Victoria to utilise their specialised equipment to locate and monitor where the hotspots are and how they are extending? Viranga, would you like to share any more on that?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and we do, as I mentioned in the last slide, there is an interagency group, and Fire Rescue Victoria are part of that, and those discussions have been had. I think the difficulties with the depth of the waste and the depth of the hotspots, the tools such as the drones and the thermal imaging can't actually visualize the heat that deep. The heat signatures aren't turning up on those using those tools because it's just too deep.
Thanks, Vuranga. And it's probably worth reiterating that's why FRV, when they initially attended the site with us right at the start of the issue, couldn't do too much more there, but we're certainly discussing any and all options and requirements for Barrow to do further monitoring on the extent possible. Thank you, Vuranga. In the interest of time, keen to move on, and certainly looks as though we've addressed some of the key questions on the hotspots regulation there. Appreciate that. So next on the agenda, we're going to talk about odour, air quality and your health. And I'd like to welcome our Acting Deputy Chief Environmental Scientist, Dr. Jen Martin.
Thanks, Steve. So as Steve has mentioned, I'm here to speak and talk through those sections of the report in relation to odour, air quality and assessment of health risk. And I just want to reiterate, as Steve and Lee and Vuranga have also said, that we've really acknowledged the impact that the odours have been having on the community. In particular, just note of we've received over 800 pollution reports from members of the St Albans and Kialba communities, and you can see the map there to the right hand side is actually an example of the clusters of reports that we've been receiving, particularly throughout Kialba and St Albans South and into St Albans East. With these odour reports, we're also hearing about symptoms that people are experiencing, such as headaches, sore throats, nausea, stinging eyes, triggering of asthma symptoms, for example, and then impacts as well to mental health and well-being and quality of life. So really want to take this moment to just reiterate that if you are feeling unwell or distressed, please do seek support. We have reached out to general practitioners in the area and provided them with a fact sheet with the data and information that we have to date. We've also put that information on the website, so if for some reason your practitioner does not have a copy, you can point them to that information and discuss it with them. If they wish to speak to us and query that information further, we're more than happy to have those discussions. So I want to talk a little bit over the next couple of sections around, what might be causing the odour, and then also onto the air quality monitoring and the results. And as we've noted, the odours that are being emitted from the hotspots, but the remediation itself is contributing to the generation of odours. As Vuranga said, that they monitor the site regularly, and the observations of EPA staff are very much consistent with the observations of community, and in the fact that these are quite offensive odours. So I just want to touch on what an odour is. It is basically chemicals that are emitted from the hotspots that have very low odour thresholds. And what that means is that they can be detected by ourselves or humans at very, very low concentrations, often at concentrations that can't actually even be measured, and that are typically well below health-based standards. But we do have physical reactions and experiences from them. They can stimulate receptors in our nasal cavities and subsequently stimulate our central nervous system. It can also stimulate sensory receptors in our respiratory tracts, in our eyes, and these are the things that are responsible. It's how we have these physical responses, such as the stinging eyes, nausea, headaches, and the triggering of asthma symptoms. Individuals will, odours are very subjective, and individuals will experience impacts quite differently. And I think it's very important just for you to know and understand that we really do understand that these are a significant impact, and that whilst they may not be posing a long-term risk to health in the context of causing a specific disease, we very much acknowledge that living with this on a daily basis is very difficult. Symptoms will typically subside when the odours are gone, but if your odours are around regularly, then you'll be experiencing symptoms on a relatively regular basis, and this isn't appropriate, and it is the basis for the focus of our regulatory action. So I want to talk a little bit about the air quality monitoring, which is slightly different to the odours in the fact that we really do try to target those kind of substances and chemicals that may pose long-term health risks. EPA initially deployed incident air monitoring in December 2019 and then required Barra Group to continue with that air quality monitoring and make sure that the results are publicly available in full. So they are on the Barra website. It targets 4 key indicator substances, which is particulate matter, which is often associated with smoke, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and volatile organic compounds. The monitoring is undertaken at 2 boundary locations, on the northern boundary and on the western boundary, to target those 2 key impacted communities of Kialba and St Albans. And the results are then assessed against the national and international long-term air quality criteria. Also, as Ryan had noted, we've also used specialised thermal imaging and monitoring equipment to try and identify sources of the odour release. So I'm going to talk a little bit here to the particulate monitoring results. We do look to PM2.5 in particular because these particles are small enough to breathe deeply into your lungs and have known to cause health effects, and they're an indicator of smoke. There's a large number of 24-hour data available from between July 2020 and October through to January 2021. Typically, the results were below the 24-hour standards, particularly for along the blue data along the northern boundary for Kialba. There were some exceedances noted along the west around St Albans. Some of these exceedances may be due to the hotspots themselves. They may also be due to machinery working in close proximity to the air quality monitoring results as well, in terms of vehicle emissions or roadside emissions as well. EPA inspections have not typically observed large amounts of smoke being generated from the hotspots, but some smoke will be generated. And in addition, EPA's reviews Barra's dust monitoring and management procedures along with other compliance inspections on a weekly basis. So just want to talk then to the volatile organics, and also just to mention as well around carbon monoxide and sulfur dioxide results were all consistently below the national air quality standards. So I'm focusing here on the volatile organics. Monitoring was undertaken along the northern and western boundaries every 3 days. So that is 1 sample every 3 days, which is over 160 samples for each location. The monitoring that is undertaken is a US EPA method, which includes 77 volatile compounds as a standard. So that is it's a standard suite of chemicals that are analysed. It includes some things that are just typical of background, for example, Freon, but it includes those really important indicator compounds that are associated with combustion. So things like the benzenes, pentanes, heptanes, and whatnot. All of the results were below the short-term guideline values for those types of effects that might be associated with irritation, for example. The average concentrations of VOCs were consistently below the long-term criteria. And where we've seen exceedances, for example, with benzenes on 2 occasions on the northern boundary and 2 occasions on the western boundary, these exceedances were seen quite some time apart, and for the most part, most results were below detection limits. So there is a very low risk of long-term, risk of health impacts over the longer term when we see sort of these small intermittent exceedances. So what do these results mean? Well, the air quality monitoring indicates that it's very unlikely that air toxics are going to result in any long-term health risk to the community. It does not diminish the reality that the odours that are being generated from the hotspots are having a real impact on people's lives, on their physical well-being, that they are causing these symptoms, and that this is really a significant driver for our regulatory action. We are looking into investigating a more broader and targeted air quality monitoring within the residential community, and that's something that will be worked through, as I think Steve has mentioned. There's going to be additional meetings in the next month or so, where we look to do additional monitoring into the community. As Ranga mentioned, resolving the odour impacts is going to align with eliminating hotspots. So it's very important, and we've very much appreciated your odour reports to help us understand more about what is occurring. So we would ask for your persistence in that. And finally, just really to close up with, if you really are experiencing, if you're unwell, experiencing distress, please do reach out to support such as your local GP. I think.
Thank you, Jen. Just having a look at the question and answers here. There's a couple in particular from Colin around PM 2.5. One in particular is noting that it's widely accepted that any exposure to PM 2.5 at any concentration for any duration is associated with negative health outcomes. So given that, Colin's interested in why has EPA downplayed its health effects in the report. So perhaps, Jen, if you could talk to that and the standards around PM 2.5.
Yeah, look, it's not to downplay generation of PM 2.5. I think it will also be really helpful to have that additional residential monitoring in over the coming to look into that more over the coming weeks and months. The data we have to date is boundary data. We've really only seen exceedances along that boundary on the western boundary for certain occasions where it would require, the appropriate wind conditions and whatnot for to exceed that exceedance well into the community. But it doesn't mean to say that individuals who are particularly susceptible to PM 2.5 might not be experiencing some issues associated with it.
Thank you, Jen. I'm just having a look at some of the other questions. I think the other question from Colin is perhaps noting there's no data provided in the report between December 2019 and 1 July 2019, and for August 2020 or beyond Feb 2021. So I guess probably just to remind people that that Barrow are publishing all their air monitoring results on their website, and EPA includes links on our website, but Colin will certainly have a look and see whether there is further monitoring information that that can be made available to address any gaps there. Just having a look. I don't think, Jen, there's too many others for you. So thank you very much for your time. I do note there was a few comments earlier in the night around what might have been causing the odours and gases. So hopefully the information Jen shared there helps address some of those questions. But in the interest of time, might go to our final section around staying informed and invite our Manager for Stakeholder Solutions, Andrew Sargent.
Thank you, mate. Thank you for passing over. And first of all, thank you for everyone that's made the time to join us this evening. It's particularly important for us that what we do is make the information that's available as accessible as possible, and we'll continue to do that in the ways that best suit community. We will obviously take all your questions from this evening, and we'll either aggregate them up and publish them in the form of Q&As, and where we can't do that, we'll address them specifically. More importantly, what we'll look to do is work with community and those that have registered this evening and come along this evening to construct a way that we can continue to engage with you directly outside of the Barrow Forum, mindful that what we need to be able to do is ensure that the information that's most important to community is available. To that end, we'll look to have a face-to-face formal forum in late August, early September, along with our partners across government, the fire services and local government, to ensure that, again, the relevant information is accessible in the forms that community would like them. Encourage everyone to, as seen on the slide, to continue to to check in for information on the dedicated website. When you're experiencing odours, either collect them via the odour diary or report them through to our contact email address, and also remind you that there's additional information that's available via the Barrow Group's web page. But once again, I would like to thank everyone very much for coming along this morning, and reiterate that we will get to all those questions that we haven't been able to get to tonight in the coming days. Thank you. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Just having a look at any further comments or question. I do note Mario mentioning earlier that's got a few likes and a response around, I thought this meeting was meant for residents to ask questions specific to the EPA report, not be told information we already know and have been told numerous times already. I'm very disappointed by this meeting. I did just want to acknowledge, Mario, that as Andrew said, this is a specific information session to firstly share the information and address obviously as many of the questions as we've been able to tonight, but there's lots of ongoing engagement and to hopefully address your concerns further, and attempted to get to as many of those as possible. Just having a look for any further questions. There is there seems to be a few questions around the mention of the PM 2.5 monitoring on the Barrow website. So we'll certainly look into that and provide information around the PM 2.5 monitoring, as we've said earlier. Thank you for bearing with me while I scroll the screen here just to see whether there's anything else jumping out that we haven't addressed. Perhaps one here from Virginia earlier in the night around, we were told the new EPA laws are not retrospective. Can this be clarified whether the licence will be reviewed under the new laws, as was mentioned by Con earlier? So perhaps just to clarify, I know in previous forums, Virginia, we've talked about elements of the law that can't be applied retrospectively to prior approvals, but that we can look at current operating licences, and we are looking at them to modernise them in line with the new Act. But Con, anything particular on that you'd like to add?
No, that's absolutely correct, Stephen. So Virginia, when we review this licence, which we will within 4 years, be assured it'll be under the framework of the new laws.
Thanks, Con. Well, I'm conscious of time, and I think we've certainly got to a lot of the questions with lots of thumbs up. Just to acknowledge, we do know there's obviously a lot of culturally and linguistically diverse communities living in and around Kelbis and Albans. We've obviously been working with our partner agencies to provide information and promotion of this session through to leaders there. But if people do need interpreter services, always available through the number there on the screen. And on that note, to let you get back to your Monday night, really appreciate your time. Lee, was there any final words you wanted to mention?
Thanks, Steve. Look, again, just to reiterate, my thanks to everyone for participating tonight. There's a number of questions that have been asked. As the team said, we will get a response to those as a priority. And I know a number of those go to, in effect, what is the future of this site. And as Con has said, a review of the licence gets undertaken, and compliance history is one of the considerations that goes into that review process, as does things such as state of knowledge, So there are a number of factors that we will consider going forward. So thank you for tonight. I look forward to when we do get the opportunity to meet in person, as Andrew talked about, and certainly you please be assured that you know we are on your side here. I know it may not feel like that all the time, but we do want to resolve this as quickly and as safely as we can, and we certainly acknowledge that the impact that this is having on you is not acceptable. So just again, thank you all for your time tonight, and we'll talk again. So thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you all.